In the spring of 1897, a mule team hauling timber out of the hills above Bishop Creek in the eastern Sierra Nevada stumbled upon something that would take nearly a century to explain. The teamsters had been cutting pine for the new railroad trestles being built across the Owens Valley when one of the mules refused to continue. The animal balked at a patch of ground that looked no different from any other, sandy soil scattered with sage and the remnants of a long-ago fire. No amount of coaxing or cursing could persuade the mule to cross that particular stretch of land. The foreman, a weathered man named Harlan Ott, walked ahead to investigate. He later told the county sheriff that he had felt a peculiar sensation as he approached the spot, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, despite the warmth of the spring afternoon. He knelt and brushed away the loose soil with his hand. Beneath the surface, no more than 6 inches down, he found a seam of pale, weathered bone. Not animal bone. Human bone. The partial skull of a child, its eye socket staring up at the California sky from a grave so shallow it had been barely covered at all. Ott and his crew had been working this stretch of the Sierra for 3 years. They knew the country. They had never seen a burial ground here, never heard talk of one. The nearest settlement was a cluster of homesteads along the creek, and the nearest town of any size was the mining camp of Independence, 20 miles to the east. Nothing in the county records, nothing in the oral histories of the few remaining Paiute elders in the region, had ever suggested that anyone had been buried in this particular hollow. But that single skull, and the dozens more that Ott's men would find over the following days, was only the beginning. By the time the sheriff arrived with a deputy and a doctor from the county seat, the teamsters had excavated 3 separate burial sites within a 100-yard radius. The graves were not arranged in any pattern that the sheriff, a man who had served in the Civil War and seen more than his share of battlefield interments, could recognize. Some were deep, nearly 6 feet down. Others were barely covered. Some of the bodies were laid on their backs with hands folded across their chests in the manner of Christian burial. Others were curled on their sides, facing east, in a pattern that the local Paiute, when consulted, would tell the sheriff was not their way. And all of them, every single body, had been buried without coffins, without markers, and without any record of their existence in the county ledger. The sheriff did what any lawman in the 1890s would have done. He documented the discovery, ordered the graves temporarily covered, and began asking questions. What he found over the following weeks would pull him into a mystery that implicated one of the most powerful families in the eastern Sierra, a private fortune built on land that was never meant to be owned, and a secret that the people of Bishop Creek had been keeping for more than 2 decades. Before we continue with the story of the Bishop Creek grave field and the ledger that finally explained it, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from tonight. Because what the sheriff discovered in the county records office in Independence would lead him not to a graveyard, but to a bank vault. And in that vault, held in trust by a man who had been dead for 6 years, was a leather-bound ledger that the bank manager had been ordered to destroy but had chosen to keep instead. A ledger that, when finally opened, would reveal the names of more than 60 men, women, and children who had been erased from the official history of California. To understand what happened in Bishop Creek in the 1870s and 1880s, you have to understand the world of the eastern Sierra Nevada in the decades after the Civil War. The mountains that rise abruptly from the Great Basin of California are a landscape of extremes, the highest peaks in the continental United States, and the hottest deserts anywhere in the world, separated by a narrow strip of high country where the seasons are compressed into a merciless cycle of drought and blizzard. The discovery of silver in the Comstock lode in Nevada in 1859 had set off a mining boom that transformed the entire region. Towns sprung up overnight in valleys that had known only the footprints of Paiute hunters and the occasional trapper. Virginia City, Goldfield, Bodie, the names were legends even before the mines began to play out. The demand for lumber to shore up the mine shafts and build the stamp mills was insatiable, and the eastern Sierra, with its vast forests of Jeffrey pine and white fir, became a timber empire. The men who came to the Sierra in those years were a rough breed. Miners, loggers, teamsters, and speculators, drawn by the promise of quick fortunes and willing to endure the brutal winters and isolation of the high country. They were white men, for the most part, though the Chinese had come too, building the railroads and working the mines that the white miners considered beneath them. And there were the Paiute, who had lived in the region for centuries and who now found themselves pushed to the margins of their own land. The Paiute in the Eastern Sierra had avoided the worst of the violence that had marked Indian-white relations in other parts of California. But they had not escaped the systematic dispossession that was the reality of the American West. By the 1870s, the Paiute had been forced onto small reservations, their lands open to white settlement, and their way of life all but destroyed. Many of them had become laborers on the very ranches and timber operations that had taken their land. The town of Bishop Creek, named for the creek that ran through it, was one of the settlements that had grown up in the wake of the timber boom. A cluster of perhaps 100 souls at its height, it was a rough place, a place of saloons and sawmills, where the men who worked the timber operations spent their wages as fast as they earned them, and where the families who had come to raise crops along the creek lived in a state of constant anxiety about the next winter's snow. The Fentworth family had arrived in the region in 1866, drawn by the timber speculation that was then at its peak. Silas Fentworth was a man of ambition and little principle. He had been a storekeeper in Ohio, a failed speculator in the California gold fields, and a minor functionary in the Nevada territorial government before he had stumbled into the timber business. He had a gift for seeing opportunity where others saw only landscape, and he had recognized that the forests of the Eastern Sierra, if properly exploited, could make a man rich. Within 3 years of his arrival, Fentworth had acquired title to thousands of acres of timberland, title that was, in many cases, legally questionable, and in a few cases, outright fraudulent. He had done it the old-fashioned way, by taking advantage of the confusion that followed the discovery of silver, the chaos of the Civil War, and the willingness of the federal government to grant land to anyone who could present a plausible claim. By 1870, Silas Fentworth was one of the largest landholders in the Eastern Sierra. He had also acquired something else, a reputation for ruthlessness that made his neighbors uneasy. He was known to have evicted squatters, bullied rival timbermen, and used his influence with the county courts to settle disputes in his favor. He had employed men who were willing to do things that other men would not, and he had paid them in cash and silence. He had also, as the county sheriff would eventually discover, acquired a secret that he had kept buried for more than 20 years. The people whose remains were found in the Bishop Creek grave field had been largely forgotten by the time Harlenott's mule balked in the spring of 1897. But their names, and the story of how they had come to be buried in that shallow, unmarked ground, were recorded in the ledger that the sheriff would eventually find in the bank vault. The ledger was the work of a man named Augustus P. Cutter, who had been the Fentworth family's agent in Bishop Creek from 1872 until his death in 1890. Cutter was not a man who would have been expected to keep a record of his employer's misdeeds. He was, by most accounts, a loyal and efficient employee, a man who had managed the Fentworth timber operations with a steady hand and a disinclination to ask too many questions. But Cutter had also kept a private journal, a journal that, when read by the sheriff, offered a window into the darkest corners of the Fentworth empire. The ledger that was found in the bank vault was not Cutter's journal, but a separate book, kept in the same careful hand, that listed the names of the people whose land Fentworth had taken, and what had happened to them. And at the end of the list, there was a notation that would change the way the sheriff viewed the entire case. Cutter wrote that the Fentworth family had acquired a portion of its land through means that were not entirely lawful, and that the people who had been displaced by those acquisitions had been provided for in a way that left no record in the county deeds. He did not specify what that meant, but the ledger entries for the years 1873 to 1875, when the grave field appeared to have been most active, suggested a pattern. The entries were brief, each consisting of a name, a date, and a location: the Bishop Creek Hollow, the upper pasture, the ridge west of the mill. The names were the names of Paiute families who had been living on the land that Fentworth had claimed. Some of them were people the sheriff recognized. He had seen their names in the county records of the 1870s, in applications for food and blankets, in the affidavits of the few missionaries who had tried to minister to the native population. The dates on the ledger entries ran from 1873 to 1885, a period of 12 years when the Paiute population in the region had dropped sharply. What Cutter's ledger suggested was that the drop was not a coincidence. The Paiute had not simply left the region. They had been removed, systematically and quietly, by the men who had taken their land. The sheriff spent weeks tracking down the living relatives of the people on the ledger list. Many of them had moved to the reservations in Nevada and Oregon, where they had been resettled by the federal government in the 1880s. Some were still in the region, living on the edges of the white communities, eking out a living as laborers. Each of them, when the sheriff explained what he had found, had a story to tell. They spoke of cattlemen who had arrived in the 1870s, claiming that the land was theirs by legal right. They spoke of armed men who had come to their villages and told them to leave. They spoke of the winter of 1874, when the snows had come early and deep, and the people who had been forced off their land had had nowhere to go, no shelter from the cold, no food to tide them over until the spring. And they spoke of the men who had died, and the shallow graves that had been dug in the frozen ground, and the promise that the bodies would be moved to a proper cemetery when the weather improved. The weather improved, but the bodies had never been moved. The Paiute who had survived the winter had been scattered across the reservation lands, and the memory of those who had died had been buried along with their bones. The sheriff interviewed the Fentworth family's surviving representatives. Silas Fentworth himself had died in 1886, leaving his estate to his son, a man named Phineas Fentworth, who had managed the timber operations in the years since. The son was a figure of considerable standing in the region, a member of the county board of supervisors, a man who had been at the center of local politics for a decade. When the sheriff asked him about the ledger entries in the grave field, Phineas Fentworth's response was measured and precise. He said that he had no knowledge of any irregularity in his father's land acquisition. He said that the Paiute had been given adequate compensation for their land, though he was unable to produce any documentation of that compensation. And he said that if there were graves on the property, they were the graves of accidental deaths that had been handled appropriately by the family's agent. The sheriff did not believe him. But he knew that proving the truth would be difficult. The ledger was evidence, but it was private evidence, and Fentworth's lawyers would argue that it was inadmissible. The witnesses were Paiute, and their testimony was unlikely to carry weight in a county where the white population had been voting for the Fentworth family for decades. What happened in Bishop Creek in the winter of 1874, and again in 1875, is the central tragedy of this story. The ledger entries for those years are more extensive than those for any other period, and they reveal a pattern of death and displacement that suggests a deliberate attempt to remove the Paiute population from the land. The winter of 1874 was one of the worst in the Sierra in decades. The snows came in early October and did not relent until April. The temperatures fell to levels that made travel impossible, and the people who had been forced off their land had no shelter from the cold. The Paiute who had been displaced by the Fentworth acquisitions had made camp in a narrow hollow along Bishop Creek, a location that offered some protection from the wind but was exposed to the deep snows that accumulated in the canyon. They had few supplies, their winter stores had been lost in the eviction, and they had no way to obtain more. The snows made it impossible to hunt or to gather firewood. The records of the Indian agent who was responsible for the region are fragmentary. The agent had been based in Independence, a town that was itself isolated during the winter months, and his reports to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington were sparse. What remains of his correspondence reveals that he knew about the evictions, and that he had written to the Fentworth family asking for an explanation. The reply he received, handwritten on stationery bearing the Fentworth letterhead, was brief and dismissive. The Fentworth family had acquired the land legally, he was told. The Paiute had been adequately compensated. The agent was advised to take care that his own affairs were in order and not to interfere in matters that were beyond his authority. The agent had not pressed the issue. He had filed his report and moved on to other concerns. But the ledger entries tell a different story. They tell the story of a family that had been displaced, a community that had been destroyed, and a group of people who had died in the snows of the Sierra, their bodies buried in shallow graves that would not be found for another 20 years. The graves were discovered in 1897 because a mule had refused to walk across the ground. The discovery had been accidental, but the significance was clear. The Fentworth family had been hiding the truth about the land for decades, and the revelation of their crimes was about to expose the full extent of their corruption. The investigation that followed the discovery of the grave field was conducted by the county sheriff, a man named Treadwell, who had held the office for nearly 20 years. Treadwell was a careful and methodical man, and he was aware of the political implications of what he had found. He knew that the Fentworth family had been a power in the region for generations. He knew that the county court, the county supervisors, and the district attorney were all men who had been elected with Fentworth support. He also knew that the Paiute, who had been the victims of the crimes, had no political power and little voice in the proceedings. Treadwell began by interviewing the surviving Paiute who had been in the region during the 1870s. The interviews were difficult. The Paiute were reluctant to speak to a white lawman, and they were aware that their testimony would be used against their former oppressors. But gradually, he obtained a picture of what had happened. The Paiute had been living on the land for generations. They had raised crops, hunted game, and fished the creeks that ran through the region. The Fentworth family had arrived in the 1860s, claiming that the land was theirs by virtue of a federal grant. The Paiute had challenged the claim, but the courts had ruled in favor of the Fentworths. The Paiute had been told to leave, and when they refused, armed men had arrived to escort them off the land. The eviction had been brutal. The Paiute had been forced from their homes at gunpoint. Their belongings had been confiscated. They had been told that they were not welcome in the region and that if they returned, they would be imprisoned or worse. The Paiute had filed complaints with the Indian agent, the county sheriff, and the district attorney. None of their complaints had resulted in any action. The deaths had been explained away as accidents. The Paiute had been exposed to the weather, and they had died of exposure or starvation. The deaths had been recorded as natural causes in the county coroner's reports. But the ledger entries revealed the truth. The deaths had been caused by the eviction, and the eviction had been caused by the Fentworth family's desire for land. The Fentworth family was never convicted of any crime. The district attorney, citing a lack of evidence, declined to prosecute. The county court ruled that the grave field was a historical curiosity and that the remains of the dead were not a matter of legal concern. The Paiute who had survived the evictions were offered no compensation and no apology. But the discovery of the ledger had an effect that was more profound than any prosecution could have been. The Fentworth family's reputation, which had been built on decades of public service and generosity, was destroyed. The newspaper accounts of the investigation, though carefully worded, made it clear that the family's fortune had been built on land that had been stolen from the Paiute. The public, which had supported the Fentworth family for generations, began to turn away. The Fentworth family sold their remaining holdings in the region in the years that followed the investigation. The timber operations were bought by a consortium of investors, and the land was eventually acquired by the federal government as part of the Inyo National Forest. The family name faded from the region's history. The ledger itself was placed in the county archive, where it was forgotten for another half-century. It was rediscovered by a historian in the 1960s, who had been researching the history of the Paiute in the Eastern Sierra. The historian recognized the significance of the document, and he published a paper on the subject in a scholarly journal. The publication of the paper brought the story of the Bishop Creek grave field to the attention of the wider public. The descendants of the Paiute who had been displaced organized a ceremony at the site of the graves, and a memorial stone was erected to honor the dead. Today, the site is part of the Inyo National Forest. It is marked by a small monument, and the names of the dead are recorded on a plaque. The trail that leads to it is not heavily used, and the site is visited only by a few who make the effort to find it. The story of the Bishop Creek grave field is a reminder of the cost of the westward expansion of the United States. It is a story of land stolen, lives destroyed, and justice denied. It is a story that has been largely forgotten by the nation that built its wealth on the land and labor of the dispossessed. What remains is the ledger, a document that records not only the names of the dead but the truth of what happened to them. The names of the Paiute who died in the winter of 1874 are not in any official record. They are not listed in the census or the county records. They were erased from history by the family who took their land. The ledger is the only record that exists of their existence. It records not only their names but the circumstances of their deaths. It is the evidence of a crime that was never punished, and a crime that the powerful family who committed it tried to hide. The story of the Bishop Creek grave field is not a story of ghosts. It is a story of the living, and of the dead who were erased from history. It is a story of the land, and the people who lived on it before the white settlers came. It is a story that has been hidden, but not forgotten. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the Fentworth family should have been held accountable for their actions? Or was the erasure of the Paiute an inevitable part of American expansion? Leave your comment below. We read every single one, asterisk asterisk. If this story has stayed with you, if you want more forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that the past is never really past, asterisk asterisk. We'll see you in the next one.